Sarah, this isn't a good time. My mother's voice cut through the sound of laughter and celebration echoing from inside the house. The house with white columns and a wraparound porch that overlooked the Atlantic Ocean. The house I had purchased 3 weeks ago for $425,000 in cash. The house whose deed sat in my purse in a custom leather presentation folder I'd had made specifically for this moment. I stood on the porch holding a gift bag, my dress from Nordstrom suddenly feeling too formal, too eager, and I watched my mother's face shift from neutral surprise to something colder as she stepped into the doorway to block my view inside. Mom, I drove 6 hours from Boston. It's your 50th anniversary party. I have something really special to give you and Dad. I could hear the pleading note in my own voice and hated myself for it. Hated that at 34 years old, after everything I had accomplished, I still sounded like a child begging for attention. She glanced over her shoulder into the house where I could see guests mingling, champagne glasses catching the late afternoon light, and when she turned back to me, her expression had hardened into something I recognized from 1,000 smaller moments throughout my life. Rebecca is giving an important toast in 10 minutes. She's worked so hard planning this whole party, and I don't want any drama or tension right now. You know how you can be, Sarah. You'll just make everything about you. The words landed like a slap, precise and practiced, and I felt my hand tighten on the gift bag handles. I'm not here to cause drama. I just want to celebrate with you. I have a gift that I think will really mean something. My mother sighed, that particular sigh that conveyed exhaustion with my very existence, and I saw movement behind her as my father appeared in the hallway, his face already arranged in that neutral expression he always wore when my mother and I were in conflict. The expression of a man who had decided decades ago that keeping the peace meant never taking sides, which really meant never taking mine. Your money doesn't fix everything, Sarah, my mother said, her voice dropping lower as a couple walked past behind her, forcing smiles at me before disappearing into the living room. Rebecca put her heart into this party. She's been planning it for months. Maybe you could come back tomorrow? We can have lunch, just the family. I opened my mouth to explain that I hadn't known about the party until Rebecca mentioned it in passing 2 weeks ago, that I hadn't been asked to help plan anything, that the gift in my purse would change their lives in ways Rebecca's catered appetizers and champagne toast never could, but my father spoke first. Maybe listen to your mother, Sarah. Not everything has to be on your schedule. Then my mother stepped back and the door closed, not slammed but firmly shut, and I stood alone on the porch of the 4-bedroom seaside mansion I owned, surrounded by the sounds of my parents' anniversary celebration happening without me, the deed to their dream home growing heavy in my purse. And I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water that nothing I ever did would be enough, because my sister Rebecca had claimed the one role I could never win, the daughter they actually wanted. I drove back to the Seascape Inn with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white, and the 30-minute drive gave me plenty of time to remember every other moment when I had stood outside the circle of my family's warmth, watching Rebecca bask in a spotlight I could never seem to find. The memories came in a flood, 20 years of them, starting with the piano recitals when I was 8 and Rebecca was 6. How our parents sat in the front row of the elementary school auditorium every single time Rebecca played her halting version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, but somehow couldn't make it to the state science fair when I was 12, the one where I won first place for my project on water purification systems, and stood on the stage scanning the audience for their faces that were never there because Rebecca had a piano competition the same day 2 towns over, a competition where she placed 7th out of 8, but came home with their pride wrapped around her like a blanket, while my first place trophy sat on my dresser, gathering dust and compliments that never came. I remembered being 17, a senior at Boston Latin School, the day I got my acceptance letter to MIT with a full scholarship, every penny paid, 4 years of elite education handed to me based on merit, and I had run downstairs waving the letter, and my mother had smiled and said, "That's wonderful, honey." before turning back to the college brochure she was reading with Rebecca about state schools. And 2 months later, when Rebecca got accepted to UMass Amherst, my parents threw a backyard party with a banner and a cake and 40 guests celebrating her very ordinary achievement, while my extraordinary one had warranted a smile and a turned back. The worst memory, though, the one that burned brightest as I pulled into the hotel parking lot, was the Young Innovator Award when I was 16, a national competition for students with patents pending, and I had developed a low-cost air quality monitor for schools in polluted areas and won $50,000. $50,000 that could have paid for college expenses, for a car for me, for anything that marked it as mine. But my father had sat me down 2 weeks after the award ceremony and explained that Rebecca really needed a reliable car for her part-time job at the mall, and wasn't I lucky that I'd have a full ride to college anyway, so I didn't need the money the way Rebecca needed stability, and I had said yes because I was 16 and I wanted to be good, and I wanted them to see that I was generous and loving and worth their attention, so the $50,000 became a Toyota Camry in Rebecca's name, and she never even thanked me directly. And our parents never acknowledged that they had taken my achievement and handed it to her like that was the natural order of things. My father had always been the same, I realized as I turned off the ignition and sat in the darkening parking lot, always keeping the peace, always smoothing things over, always asking me to understand that Rebecca was more sensitive, more fragile, needed more support, as if I were made of stone instead of flesh, as if I had no feelings to hurt because I had the audacity to be competent. 20 years of this pattern, 20 years of trying harder and achieving more, and watching it all disappear into the void of their indifference, while Rebecca's mediocrity received standing ovations. And I sat there with the deed to a $425,000 house in my purse, and finally asked myself the question I should have asked decades ago. Why did I keep trying to win a game where the rules were designed to make sure I always lost? The pattern hadn't stopped when I graduated from MIT, hadn't even slowed when I founded my company at 28. And sitting in that hotel room the night I was turned away from my own gift, I traced the years of my adult life and saw the same dynamic playing out with different details, but identical dismissal. I had started Chen Security Solutions 6 years ago, building cybersecurity software specifically designed for small businesses that couldn't afford enterprise-level protection, and in those 6 years, I had called my parents every month with updates, told them about our first client and our 10th and our 100th, explained what we did and why it mattered and how we were growing, and every single conversation had ended the same way, with my mother saying, "That's nice, honey," before pivoting to tell me about Rebecca's job as a dental hygienist, how she was so good with patients, how her boss just loved her, how she'd gotten a $50 bonus for perfect attendance. Rebecca's $50 attendance bonus received more enthusiastic phone calls than my company's first million in revenue. I remembered 3 years ago, December, when my company was featured in Forbes' 30 Under 30 list for cybersecurity innovation, a full profile with my photo and quotes about disrupting the industry, and that same week, Rebecca had been named Employee of the Month at the dental practice where she worked, and my parents had sent out their annual Christmas card with a photo and a letter detailing the family's year. And the letter mentioned Rebecca's Employee of the Month award with 3 full sentences of pride, while my Forbes feature was condensed into "Sarah's company is doing well." 7 words to summarize what should have been the highlight of their parental bragging. I had taped that Christmas card to my bathroom mirror and looked at it every morning for a month, trying to understand the math of how my extraordinary became less than Rebecca's ordinary. My romantic life had received even harsher treatment, every relationship I'd had since college dissected and found wanting, my mother asking why I was so picky, why I couldn't just settle down like normal people, suggesting that my career focus was really just fear of commitment, while Rebecca's marriage at 23 and divorce at 27 was treated with gentle sympathy. Poor Rebecca, who had tried so hard, who had loved so much, who deserved support and understanding, and had moved back home for 8 months, where our parents had cooked her meals and done her laundry and told her she was brave for leaving a man who, from what I could tell, had done nothing worse than expect her to contribute equally to household chores. But the financial dynamic was perhaps the clearest evidence of how little they valued what I provided. Because for 5 years I had been sending them $2,000 every month, $24,000 a year, $120,000 total, money I sent to help with their mortgage and repairs and daily expenses after my father's hours were cut at the manufacturing plant where he'd worked for 30 years. $2,000 every month, transferred automatically on the first, and they had never once thanked me directly, never acknowledged the cumulative weight of that support, and when Rebecca had asked them last year how they were managing financially, my mother had told her that Sarah helps out a little sometimes, as if my systematic, substantial, unwavering support was the equivalent of occasionally picking up a dinner check. I had offered multiple times to help them fix up their house, the one they'd lived in for 25 years in Quincy, the one with the leaking roof and the foundation cracks, and the outdated electrical system, and every offer had been declined with the same explanation. They didn't want to feel like they were taking advantage, didn't want me to think they expected anything, didn't want it to seem like they were showing off to the neighbors about having a daughter with money. But when Rebecca needed a co-signer for her apartment lease after her divorce, they had signed immediately, and when she needed furniture, they had driven her to IKEA and paid for everything, and somehow that wasn't showing off, that was just helping family. It was 3 months ago, sitting in my lawyer's office finalizing the sale of my company for $48 million, my personal net worth suddenly sitting at $12 million after investors took their share, that I decided to make one final attempt at proving my love in a language so clear they couldn't possibly misinterpret it, and I started looking for a house that would change their lives, a gesture so grand that surely, finally, they would have to see me. The acquisition closed on a Tuesday morning in February, 3 months before my parents' 50th anniversary, and I sat in the conference room of Morrison and Associates, watching my lawyer Beth Morrison slide the final documents across the mahogany table, while representatives from TechCore Security nodded and smiled and shook my hand. And just like that, my company became theirs for $48 million, and my portion after the investors took their shares came to $12 million, a number so large I had trouble attaching it to reality, even as I signed my name and watched the wire transfer confirmation appear on Beth's laptop screen. I told almost no one about the sale because I had learned over the years that talking about my success only created distance between me and my family, only gave them more reasons to see me as the daughter who didn't need them, who had left them behind, who thought she was too good for her raising. So I kept quiet and deposited the money and sat in my Cambridge apartment that night, thinking about what to do with a fortune I had never expected to have. And the only thought that kept returning was that maybe now, finally, I could do something so undeniably generous that my parents would have to see it as love instead of showing off. I started looking at houses the next week, working with a real estate agent named Patricia Hendricks, who specialized in Cape Cod properties, and I told her exactly what I wanted. Something beautiful, something that would change someone's life, something near the ocean, because my mother had always talked about wanting to hear the waves. 4 bedrooms so there would be space for family gatherings, completely renovated so my father wouldn't have to worry about repairs, and a price tag that reflected not just market value, but the weight of what I was trying to prove. It took 6 weeks of searching, driving down to the Cape every weekend to walk through properties with Patricia, and then we found it. A white colonial with columns and a wraparound porch on Seaview Drive in Dennis, 4 bedrooms and 3 baths, completely gutted and renovated by the previous owners who had put it on the market after a job transfer to California, ocean visible from the master bedroom and the back deck, hardwood floors and granite counters, and every detail perfect. Listed at $420,000, but I offered $425,000 in cash because I wanted there to be no doubt, no delays, no complications. The closing took 3 weeks, and I paid cash and told no one in my family what I was doing. And I coordinated with Rebecca about the anniversary party she was planning. mentioning casually that I wanted to bring a special gift, and her response over text was dismissive. Just, "Mom's not going to care about whatever you're bringing, she's just happy to have family together." And I should have heard the warning in those words, but instead I interpreted them through the lens of hope, thinking that surely when they saw what I had done, they would understand that this was love, that everything I had ever achieved had been an attempt to earn the pride they gave so freely to Rebecca for accomplishments that paled in comparison to mine. I had professional photographs taken of the house, hired a photographer to capture every angle in perfect afternoon light, and I took those photos to a print shop and had them bound in a custom leather presentation folder, along with the deed that had my parents' names typed in the recipient field but not yet transferred, waiting for the moment when I would hand it to them in front of everyone they knew, and watch their faces transform from confusion to shock to joy to pride. And I imagined my mother crying and my father hugging me, and Rebecca finally seeing me as someone worthy of the family's love. The morning of the party, I woke up in my Boston apartment at 5 a.m., even though I didn't need to leave until 9, and I showered and did my makeup carefully, and put on the dress I had bought from Nordstrom specifically for this occasion, a navy blue sheath that was elegant without being flashy, and I placed the leather presentation folder in my leather tote bag, along with a card I had written by hand, explaining what the house meant, how I wanted them to have security and beauty and peace in their retirement, and I drove the 6 hours from Boston to Cape Cod with my heart pounding and my hands steady on the wheel, believing that this was the gesture that would finally, after 34 years, make me visible to the people whose approval I had chased through every achievement and every success and every desperate attempt to prove I was worth loving. I arrived at the house at 2 in the afternoon, exactly the time Rebecca had told me the party started, and I sat in my car for a moment, just looking at the white colonial with its columns and wraparound porch, the ocean visible beyond the back deck, late spring sunlight making everything look like it belonged in a magazine spread, and I felt a surge of pride and terror, because this beautiful thing was mine, and in a few minutes it would be theirs, and surely this gesture was large enough to bridge the distance that had always existed between us. Cars filled the driveway and lined the street, easily 40 or 50 vehicles, and I could hear music and laughter floating from inside. The sounds of a party in full swing, and I grabbed my leather tote bag with the presentation folder inside and walked up the front path, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs with each step. The porch was exactly as beautiful as I remembered from the walk-through, white painted boards and hanging baskets of flowers that the staging company had left, and through the front windows I could see people mingling in the living room that I had bought, drinking wine and eating appetizers in the kitchen I owned, celebrating in a space that belonged to me but that they thought belonged to someone else, and I rang the doorbell with a hand that trembled just slightly. My mother opened the door and her face went from neutral to something cold in the span of a heartbeat. And before I could even say hello, she stepped onto the porch and pulled the door mostly closed behind her, creating a barrier between me and the warmth and noise inside. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" she said. And it wasn't a question but a statement, flat and unwelcoming. "I'm here for your anniversary party," I said, trying to smile, trying to ignore the ice in her voice. "Rebecca told me it started at 2. My mother glanced back through the window where I could see guests starting to notice us, and when she looked back at me, her expression was harder. "Rebecca is about to give a toast, a very important toast that she's worked hard on, and I don't think it's a good time for you to come in and create drama." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I actually took a step backward. "Create drama? Mom, I drove 6 hours to be here. I have a gift for you and Dad, something special." "Your money doesn't fix everything, Sarah," my mother interrupted, and her voice carried that particular tone I had heard my entire life, the one that suggested I was being difficult, demanding, inappropriate. Rebecca put her heart into this party. She planned everything, coordinated with all our friends, spent weeks making sure every detail was perfect. She did this out of love, not because she's trying to prove something. I stood there holding my tote bag with $425,000 worth of house deed inside it and processed what my mother had just revealed. Rebecca had planned this party, had been the one to coordinate everything, and had apparently positioned herself as the devoted daughter while somehow ensuring I remained peripheral, unwelcome, unnecessary. "I just want to give you your gift," I said quietly, and I hated how small my voice sounded. My father appeared in the doorway behind my mother, his face creased with the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 50 years avoiding conflict. "Maybe listen to your mother, Sarah," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Today's been perfect so far. Let's not complicate things." Through the window, I could see Rebecca standing in the center of the living room, raising a champagne glass, her mouth moving in what was clearly the beginning of a speech, and I watched my parents' friends and relatives turn toward her with smiling faces, giving her their complete attention in a way they had never given me. And my mother's hand was already on the doorknob, already closing the door, already choosing Rebecca's toast over my presence. And the last thing I saw before the door shut completely was my sister's triumphant face as everyone applauded whatever she had just said, and I was left standing on the porch of the house I owned, holding a gift no one wanted, locked out of my own desperate gesture of love. I walked back to my car on legs that felt disconnected from my body, my hand fumbling with the key fob twice before I managed to unlock the door, and I sat in the driver's seat of my Tesla with the leather presentation folder still in my tote bag and watched through the front windows of the house I owned, as my sister stood in the center of the living room with a champagne glass raised, her mouth moving in animated speech while everyone around her smiled and nodded and applauded, and I could see my mother's face in profile, beaming at Rebecca with an expression of such pure pride that it felt like a knife sliding between my ribs. I sat there for what might have been 5 minutes or 30, time losing meaning as I stared at the scene playing out behind glass, and my hands were shaking so badly that I had to grip the steering wheel to make them stop. And something inside me, that had been bending for 34 years, finally reached its breaking point and snapped cleanly in two. I pulled the presentation folder out of my bag and opened it on my lap, looking at the deed with my parents' names in the recipient field, looking at the professional photographs of rooms full of people who had just celebrated in a space I had bought for them, and I thought about the pattern that had defined my entire life: achieve something extraordinary, watch it be minimized or ignored, try harder, achieve something even more extraordinary. Watch the cycle repeat while Rebecca's ordinary accomplishments were treated like miracles. I realized with a clarity that felt almost physical that I had been seeking validation from people who would never give it, that I had been trying to earn love that should have been freely offered, that I had spent $12 million worth of success trying to purchase something that couldn't be bought, and the understanding settled over me like a weight and a relief all at once. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Beth Morrison's contact information, my real estate attorney who had handled the purchase just 3 weeks ago, and I called her even though it was a Saturday afternoon, and I knew I might be interrupting her weekend. "Beth, it's Sarah Chen," I said when she answered, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I need you to do something for me, tomorrow morning." She asked what I needed, and I told her I wanted to list the Cape Cod property for sale immediately. And there was a pause on the other end of the line that stretched long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. "Sarah, you just closed on that property 3 weeks ago," Beth said carefully. "Is everything all right?" I looked at the house one more time, at the party still visible through the windows, at the life I had tried to give to people who didn't want it from me. "Everything's fine," I said. "I just made a mistake. I thought this investment would return something it can't. List it tomorrow. I'll take a loss if I need to." I started the car and drove away from the white colonial with its columns and wraparound porch, drove away from the sounds of celebration and my sister's triumph and my parents' choice, and I checked into the Seascape Inn 4 miles down the coast, a small boutique hotel with ocean views and a front desk clerk who didn't ask why I looked like I'd been crying. That night, I lay awake in the hotel room with my laptop open on the bed, and I did what I had always done when faced with a problem. I analyzed it with the same logic I applied to business decisions, breaking down the pattern of investment and return, calculating the cost of continuing to pour resources into a relationship that had never valued what I offered, and I thought about my company and how I had built it through resilience and strategic thinking and the ability to recognize when something wasn't working and pivot accordingly. I had never applied that same ruthless clarity to my personal life, had never treated my family relationships as something that could be assessed and adjusted. But lying there in that hotel room with the deed to a house they didn't know I owned and wouldn't let me give them, I understood that some investments need to be cut before they drain everything you have, and my decision solidified into something hard and certain and surprisingly peaceful. I woke the next morning to my phone vibrating continuously on the nightstand, a steady rhythm of notifications that pulled me out of the first real sleep I'd had in 48 hours. And when I reached for it with blurry eyes, I saw 17 missed calls and 32 text messages, most of them from my business partner Chen, and people I'd worked with over the past 6 years. And the preview of Jamie's most recent message read, "Sarah, why didn't you tell me it was public today?" And I sat up in the hotel bed with my heart suddenly racing because I had no idea what she was talking about. I opened my phone and started scrolling through messages, and every single one was congratulatory. People saying things like, "So proud of you," and "Incredible news," and "You deserve this." And I pulled up my news app with hands that had started shaking again, and there it was on the Forbes technology page with a headline that made my breath catch in my throat. 34-year-old Sarah Chen exits cybersecurity startup in $48 million deal. The article detailed everything I had kept quiet for 3 months: the acquisition of SecureScope by a major tech firm, the terms of the deal that had netted me personally $12 million after investor payouts, my journey from MIT scholarship student to founder at 28 to successful exit at 34. And there was a professional photo of me from last year's tech conference looking confident and accomplished in a way that felt like a stranger. And the article described how I had revolutionized digital security for small businesses and identified a critical gap in the market that larger firms had overlooked. I scrolled through more messages and saw texts from college friends I hadn't spoken to in years, from former professors, from professional contacts and conference acquaintances, all of them reaching out to acknowledge what I had achieved. And my phone showed 43 new LinkedIn connection requests, and my email inbox had over 100 unread messages. And I sat there in that hotel room reading congratulations from people who barely knew me, while the 3 people whose recognition I had spent my entire life seeking had not sent a single word. I pulled up my recent calls and confirmed what I already knew. Nothing from my parents, nothing from Rebecca, just silence from the family I had tried to gift a house to less than 24 hours ago. And the contrast between the world's response and their absence felt like a final answer to a question I had been asking since childhood. I called Beth Morrison, and when she answered, I could hear the surprise in her voice when I said, "Change of plans, I'm selling the house." And there was a long pause before she said carefully, "Sarah, you just bought that property 3 weeks ago for your parents. Are you sure about this?" And I looked at the Forbes article still open on my phone and thought about standing on that porch yesterday holding a gift no one wanted, and I said, "They don't want my gifts. List it today. I'll take a small loss if I need to." Beth's voice shifted into professional mode, and she said something that made my decision feel less like devastation and more like perfect timing. "Actually, I have a client who's been looking for exactly this kind of property in that area. Same specifications. They'd likely pay $440,000, possibly more." And I felt something loosen in my chest as I said, "Perfect. Draw up the papers." Because the house that was supposed to prove my love would instead prove that I knew when to walk away from a bad investment. I was still sitting in the hotel room reading through messages when my phone rang with Rebecca's name on the screen. and I stared at it for 3 full rings before I answered because I knew exactly what this call would be about. And when I said hello, her voice came through bright and artificial with an enthusiasm I had never heard directed at me in my entire life. "Sarah! Oh my God! Why didn't you tell us about selling your company?" she said. And I could hear her performing excitement the way she had performed devotion at yesterday's party. And when I didn't immediately respond, she rushed forward with, "I just saw the Forbes article and I am so incredibly proud of you. We should celebrate. Are you still in town? Let's have lunch, just the two of us, sister time." I agreed to meet her in an hour at a waterfront restaurant called the Dockside because I was curious to see how this performance would unfold. And when I arrived, she was already there at a table by the window wearing a dress that looked expensive in a way that meant she had put effort into this meeting. And she stood up and hugged me with a theatricality that made the couple at the next table glance over with smiles at what must have looked like a touching reunion. We sat down, and Rebecca immediately signaled the server, and when he came over, she said with a gesture toward me, "My sister just made millions. We're celebrating. Bring us champagne." And I watched her play the role of proud sibling while the server congratulated me, and Rebecca beamed like she had personally contributed to my success. And after he left, she leaned forward and said, "Seriously, Sarah, $48 million? I mean, I knew your little tech thing was doing okay, but I had no idea it was that successful." I sipped the water already on the table and said nothing, and she continued talking the way she always did when she wanted something, building up to her actual purpose with layers of flattery and performance. And finally, after the champagne arrived and she had made a toast to my success, she shifted into what I had known was coming from the moment she called. "So I have to be honest with you about something," Rebecca said, her voice dropping into confidential sister mode. "My divorce. It left me in a really difficult position financially, and I've been trying to handle it on my own because you know me. I hate asking for help, but I'm about $45,000 in debt between the legal fees and splitting assets, and I was wondering if maybe you could help me out now that you have all this money." She said it like it was a small favor, like $45,000 was nothing to someone who had just made 12 million tests. And before I could respond, she added, "And also, Mom and Dad are really stressed about their house repairs. The foundation has issues and the roof is leaking. It's going to cost something like $80,000 to fix everything, and I know they would never ask you directly, but maybe you could just handle it for them? I mean, you have so much now." I looked at my sister across the table and saw her mentally calculating what she could extract from my success, saw her assuming that my money was available to solve her problems and our parents' problems, while yesterday she had actively worked to exclude me from their celebration. And I said very quietly, "Tell me more about the house repairs Mom and Dad need." Rebecca leaned forward and started detailing the problems with our parents' house. The foundation cracks that had been getting worse over the past 2 years, the roof that leaked every time it rained heavily, the outdated electrical system that an inspector had said was borderline dangerous, and she estimated the total cost at around $80,000 for everything that needed to be fixed. "They're too proud to ask you directly," Rebecca said. "But you could just handle it, right? I mean, you have so much now, and they really need help, and I would contribute if I could, but with my debt situation, I'm barely keeping my head above water." I watched her perform concern for our parents while simultaneously asking me to solve her financial problems and theirs. And I took a sip of the champagne I hadn't wanted and said very calmly, "I actually already solved their housing problem." Rebecca's expression shifted from performative concern to genuine interest, and she said, "What do you mean?" with her head tilting in that way she had when she was trying to figure out an angle. And I set down my glass and looked directly at her and said, "I bought them a house, the one where the party was yesterday." The change in her face was remarkable. Shock first as she processed what I had said, then confusion as she tried to work out the timeline, and then I watched calculation move across her features as she started to understand the implications. "Wait, that house? The mansion? You bought that?" she said, her voice rising slightly. And I nodded and said, "Closed 3 weeks ago. I was bringing them the deed yesterday when Mom turned me away from the door." Rebecca sat back in her chair, and I could see her mind working through this new information, and I knew exactly what she was thinking because I had watched her calculate advantages our entire lives. If our parents owned that house outright, they would have no mortgage, which meant their limited retirement income would stretch further, which meant they would have more capacity to help her with her debt. And beyond that, if they owned a $425,000 property, she would eventually inherit half its value. Her face went through another transformation, and suddenly she was angry. But not at me. She was angry at our mother. And she said, "She didn't let you in? When you were giving them a house? A house worth almost $500,000? I watched her recalculate yesterday's events through this new lens, watched her realize that she had helped orchestrate my exclusion from an event at a property I had purchased, and she said, "Sarah, you have to give them the deed. They need to know about this. This is incredible. This changes everything for them." She pulled out her phone like she was going to call our parents right then, and I said quietly, "I listed it for sale this morning." The silence that followed was complete. Even the restaurant noise seemed to fade away, and Rebecca stared at me with her phone still in her hand and said, "You what? You can't sell their house," Rebecca said, her voice rising enough that the couple at the next table looked over with concern. "You bought it for them." I set down my champagne glass and looked at my sister across the table and said very calmly, "They made it clear they don't want anything from me." And I watched her face flush with an anger that seemed disproportionate until I understood that she was realizing how this would affect her own calculations, her own future inheritance, her own access to parents who might have more resources to help with her debt. "This is ridiculous," Rebecca said, leaning forward with her hands flat on the table. "So Mom made a mistake at the door. So what? You're going to punish them by taking away a house?" I shook my head slowly and said, "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm simply not giving a gift to people who have made it clear my gifts aren't welcome." And something in my calm tone seemed to infuriate Rebecca more, because her carefully constructed mask began to slip, and she said, "You know what? I told Mom you would show off. I told her you'd make the party about yourself and your money, and I was right." The admission hung in the air between us, and I felt something click into place, the final piece of understanding about what had actually happened yesterday. "You told her to keep me away," I said, and it wasn't a question. Rebecca's face showed a moment of recognition that she had revealed too much, but she was too angry now to pull back, and she said, "I worked hard on that party. I spent weeks planning every detail, making sure everything was perfect for them. And I knew you would just show up and make it all about you and your success and your money like you always do." I sat very still and listened to my sister confess to actively sabotaging me, and she continued, "You always have to make everything about you and your success. You got the brains, the scholarship, the career, you got everything, and I got nothing. So yes, I have the one thing you don't have, the one thing I can have, Mom and Dad's love." She said it like a victory and an accusation at the same time, and I realized she had spent years telling our parents that I thought I was too good for them, positioning herself as the devoted daughter while painting me as the distant, arrogant one. "You can have it," I said quietly, and my calm response seemed to infuriate her more than anything else I could have said. "I'm done competing for scraps of approval from people who have decided I'm not worth their attention." Rebecca stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're being selfish. That house could change their lives. They need help with repairs. They're struggling, and you could solve all of it, but instead you're selling the house out of spite." I looked up at my sister and said, "My monthly checks for 5 years could have changed their lives. That's $120,000, Rebecca. My offer to pay for repairs could have changed things. My offer to set up college funds for your kids could have changed things. Every gesture I've made for the past decade could have changed things. But none of it mattered because none of it was ever enough. Rebecca grabbed her purse and said, "I'm telling them everything. I'm telling them exactly what you're doing." And she walked out of the restaurant, leaving me sitting alone at the table with 2 glasses of champagne and the check. And I paid it, and left a generous tip, because the server didn't deserve to be caught in my family's dysfunction. And I drove back to my hotel knowing that the confrontation I had been avoiding for 20 years was finally about to happen. I was back at the Seascape Inn for less than 2 hours when the front desk called my room to tell me I had visitors in the lobby, and I knew immediately who it was, because Rebecca had promised to tell them everything, and she had never been one to delay when drama was available. I took my time going downstairs, carrying the presentation folder with the deed and all the materials I had prepared for a celebration that never happened. And when I stepped out of the elevator, I saw my parents sitting in the lobby's overstuffed chairs, looking uncomfortable and out of place among the coastal decor and the other hotel guests. My mother stood up first, her face set in that expression I knew so well, the one that said she had already decided how this conversation would go. And my father rose more slowly with his hands in his pockets, and that perpetually uncomfortable look he got whenever conflict was unavoidable. "Rebecca says you bought a house and you're selling it out of spite," my mother said, her voice carrying across the lobby, and I saw an elderly couple near the fireplace look up from their books with interest. My father put a hand on my mother's arm and said, "Margaret, maybe we should talk somewhere private." But I shook my head and said, "Here is fine. I don't have anything to hide." And I gestured to the seating area near the window where we would at least have the illusion of privacy, even though I knew the other guests would hear everything. My father looked at me with an expression that might have been concern or might have been his usual desire to smooth things over without actually addressing anything real, and he said, "That's not like you, Sarah. What's this really about?" As if my entire personality could be summed up as someone who never caused problems, never made waves, never demanded to be seen. I sat down and placed the presentation folder on the coffee table between us, opened it carefully to reveal the deed with its official stamps and legal language, and I pulled out the professional photographs of the Cape Cod house with its white columns and wraparound porch and the ocean visible in the background. "I bought you the house you were partying in," I said, keeping my voice level and calm. "I drove 6 hours from Boston to give you this for your 50th anniversary. I had it professionally photographed. I had the deed put in a custom presentation folder. I planned to give it to you in front of your 150 guests as a celebration of your marriage and your life together. Mom wouldn't let me in the door." My mother's face went through a rapid series of changes as she looked at the deed and understood that I was telling the truth, and I watched her process the implications of what had happened. But then her expression settled into defensiveness, and she said, "Well, Rebecca said you'd just be showing off. You always have to prove you're better than her, and I didn't want you disrupting the party she worked so hard to plan." I looked at my mother and said very quietly, "When have I ever done that? When have I ever tried to prove I'm better than Rebecca?" And I started listing the examples that had accumulated over decades, my voice steady as I recounted every achievement that had been minimized, every success that had been dismissed, every time Rebecca had been praised for something ordinary, while my extraordinary accomplishments went unnoticed by the 2 people whose notice I wanted most. My mother started to respond, but I held up my hand and pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and turned the screen toward both of them so they could see the transaction history that I had prepared as a screenshot the night before when I couldn't sleep and knew this confrontation was inevitable. "These are the monthly transfers I've been sending you," I said, scrolling through the list of $2,000 payments that went back exactly 5 years, 60 months of consistent support that added up to a number that made my father's face go pale when I said it out loud. $120,000. You told Rebecca I help a little sometimes. This is what a little looks like." My father leaned forward to look at the screen more closely, his hand reaching out as if he wanted to touch it to verify it was real, and he said in a voice that sounded genuinely shocked, "We thought it was maybe a few hundred here and there. We didn't realize you were sending this much. We never added it up. And I saw my mother's face showing a similar confusion, as if the cumulative weight of my support had somehow escaped their notice, even as they deposited every check. I switched to my browser and pulled up the Forbes article that had published the day before, the one with my photograph and the headline about the $48 million acquisition, and I held the phone where they could both see it clearly. My company was acquired for $48 million. I personally netted $12 million after investors were paid out. This article published yesterday morning. Did either of you call to congratulate me? The silence that followed was answer enough, and I watched my mother's face cycle through emotions while my father looked down at his hands. And finally, my mother said with defensiveness creeping into her voice, "We didn't know! You never told us!" I felt something crack open in my chest, years of careful control beginning to fracture. And I said, "I've told you about my company for 6 years. Every time we talked, I mentioned something about the business, about our clients, about our growth. But you never asked questions. You never wanted details. You treated it like a hobby I would eventually outgrow." My voice was getting louder, and I knew the elderly couple by the fireplace could hear every word, but I didn't care anymore because the truth was finally pouring out after being held back for decades. Rebecca got Employee of the Month at her dentist office, and you called me specifically to tell me about it. You sent me a photo of her certificate. You posted about it on Facebook. I got into Forbes magazine, and I got silence. I opened my photos and started scrolling, finding images I had saved over the years, and I held up the phone to show them the Young Innovator Award from when I was 16, the big ceremonial check for $50,000 that I was holding with a proud smile. "Do you remember this? I won this award for designing educational software. You used the money to buy Rebecca a car for her 16th birthday because she needed it more, and I was too young to drive anyway." My father said, "Sarah, you always seemed fine. You always had everything under control. You didn't need us the way Rebecca did." And those words landed like physical blows because they revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had shaped my entire relationship with my parents. The assumption that competence meant I didn't need love, that achievement meant I didn't need recognition, that strength meant I didn't need them at all. My voice broke for the first time when I said, "I needed you to be proud of me." And I felt the tears starting even though I had promised myself I would stay controlled and composed through this entire confrontation, but the weight of 34 years was suddenly too much to carry with steady hands. "Do you know what it's like to excel at everything, achieve everything you're supposed to, and still feel invisible?" I asked. And my mother's face was changing as she watched me, something shifting behind her eyes that might have been the beginning of real understanding instead of defensiveness. I looked directly at my father and said, "I bought you a $425,000 house because I wanted to see you look at me the way you look at Rebecca when she does anything ordinary. I wanted you to be proud of something I did. I wanted to matter." And the rawness in my voice made the elderly couple by the fireplace look away, as if they were intruding on something too private for strangers to witness. My father started to say, "Sarah, we love you." But I shook my head and said, "You love the idea of me, the self-sufficient one, the one who doesn't need anything, the one who's always fine no matter what. But you don't actually see me as a person who has feelings and needs and wants to be celebrated by her parents." I reached into the presentation folder and pulled out the second document I had brought. The printed email chain from 2 months ago that I had saved because some part of me had known even then that I would need evidence of what had really happened. "2 months ago, I told Rebecca about the house," I said, holding up the papers so they could see the email header with the date and timestamps. "I asked her to help me coordinate the surprise. I wanted to work with her, to make this something we did together for you." I read Rebecca's response out loud, my voice steady now as I quoted her exact words. "Mom won't care. She'll think you're showing off. Maybe don't come to party?" My parents turned to look at each other, and I saw the realization dawning on their faces. that Rebecca had known exactly what I was planning to give them and had actively worked to prevent me from being there. She didn't just fail to tell me about the party, I said. She actively kept me away because she knew what I was bringing. She knew it would overshadow her toast and her decorations and her role as the devoted daughter who planned everything. My mother started to cry, real tears that might have been genuine remorse, and she said, I didn't know, I didn't understand. I thought you didn't care about these things because you never said anything. You never complained. I looked at her and said very quietly, I'm a human being, Mom. I care about everything. I care that you forgot my MIT acceptance. I care that you used my award money for Rebecca's car. I care that you missed my state science fair championship. I care that you've never once asked me a real question about my company. I care that you turned me away from the door of a house I bought for you. I care about all of it, even though I learned a long time ago that showing I cared made me seem weak or needy or like I was asking for too much. I saw Beth Morrison walking through the hotel lobby before my parents did, her practical gray suit and leather briefcase, making her look exactly like what she was, the competent attorney who had handled the Cape Cod property purchase with efficiency and discretion over the past month. I had texted her during the confrontation with my parents, asking her to come at exactly this time because I needed the physical presence of documentation to make what came next feel real and irreversible. And when she reached our seating area near the fireplace, I stood and said, Mom, Dad, this is Beth Morrison, my real estate attorney, watching their faces register confusion about why my lawyer would be joining this family crisis. Beth shook their hands with professional courtesy and then turned to me and said in a clear voice that carried across the lobby, I have the new sale papers for the Cape Cod property ready for your signature. And I saw my mother's face go white as the meaning of those words landed. The buyers are paying $440,000, closing in 2 weeks, so you'll actually net a small profit after closing costs, Beth continued, pulling a folder from her briefcase, and my father made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. My mother started to say something, but I held up my hand and said, I'm also establishing a trust fund for both of you, $200,000, specifically designated for your retirement expenses and medical care. And I watched them struggle to process this shift from loss to gain, their faces showing the confusion of people who couldn't understand the rules of the game anymore. Beth pulled out a second set of papers and said, I've already drawn up the trust documents with First Harbor Bank as trustee. The funds will be available for approved expenses but managed independently. And I looked at my parents directly and said, This is what I can give you. Financial security handled through proper channels. What I can't give anymore is pieces of myself to people who don't value them. My father said, Sarah, you don't have to do this. We can work this out. But I shook my head and said, I need you to go to family therapy with Rebecca to understand how you created a dynamic where she had to sabotage me to feel valued and where I had to achieve millions to feel seen. I pulled out the card I had prepared the night before at the Hotel Business Center, Dr. Patricia Ward's contact information printed neatly with her specialization in family systems therapy and adult sibling dynamics, and I handed it to my mother and said, I've already consulted with her. She's expecting your call. She has availability starting next week. My mother took the card with shaking hands and said, What if we wanted to work on this now? What if we don't need a therapist? What if we can just fix this as a family? And I felt something hard and protective settle around my heart as I said, Then you start by calling me on my birthday for the first time in 8 years, without Rebecca reminding you. My birthday is March 14th, that's 6 months from now, and if your name appears on my phone that day without any prompting from my sister, then I'll know you're serious about change. 6 months later, on March 14th, I woke up in my new Boston penthouse, to the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the harbor. And I lay there for a moment, thinking about all the birthdays before this one, when I had checked my phone hoping to see my parents' names and finding only silence or Rebecca's hurried text at 9 p.m. saying, Oh God, I forgot to remind Mom and Dad it's your birthday. My phone sat on the nightstand charging, and I looked at it without reaching for it, having learned over the past 6 months that my worth was not determined by whether that screen lit up with their names, but at exactly 8:30 a.m. it rang, and I saw Mom's cell on the display and felt something catch in my chest. I answered and heard my mother's voice saying, "Happy birthday, Sarah." And there was an awkwardness to it that told me she had been nervous to make this call. And my father got on the line too, saying they were on speaker, and they just wanted to wish me a good day and ask if I had any plans. We talked for 17 minutes about ordinary things, and I told them about the new cybersecurity venture I had started, a smaller consulting firm that let me work directly with clients. And my mother actually asked questions about what kind of security issues small businesses faced. And my father wanted to know if I was working too hard and taking care of myself. They told me they had been going to Dr. Ward's office every week, sometimes together and sometimes separately, and that Rebecca was doing her own therapy on Thursdays. And my mother said very quietly, "We're learning a lot about how we failed you, and I know this doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know we're trying." They asked if I would come to dinner the following weekend, just the three of us, at whatever restaurant I wanted, and I said yes and suggested a small Italian place in Cambridge that I had always liked. And when we hung up, I sat holding my phone and feeling something I had not felt in relation to my parents for most of my adult life, which was cautious hope. 3 days later, Rebecca called, and I almost did not answer because our last conversation had been her angry voicemail after the hotel confrontation, calling me selfish and cruel. But I picked up and heard her say, "I know I don't deserve your time, but I wanted to say happy belated birthday, and also I'm sorry." The conversation was stilted and uncomfortable, and she told me that her therapist had helped her understand that she had made me the enemy instead of dealing with her own insecurity about not having a clear identity outside of being the favored daughter. And she said, "I sabotaged you because watching you succeed made me feel like a failure. And that was my issue, not yours, and I'm working on it." I did not tell her I forgave her because I was not sure I did yet, but I told her I accepted her acknowledgement and appreciated that she was doing the work. And we hung up after only 6 minutes, but it was more honest than most conversations we had ever had. The following Tuesday, I sat in my new office on the 14th floor of a building in the financial district. My company's name, Chen Security Consulting, visible in brushed steel letters on the glass door. And I looked at the photograph on my desk from the dinner with my parents the previous week. We were sitting at a corner table at the Italian restaurant, and my father had asked the server to take our picture. And in it, my mother's hand was reaching toward mine across the table, and all three of us looked uncertain but present. And it was not a perfect family portrait, but it was real in a way that our Christmas cards had never been. I thought about the custom presentation folder that still sat in my file cabinet at home with the deed to a house I had bought and sold within a month, and I realized that I had been trying to build a foundation for my parents' approval on sand that would never hold weight. The real gift I had given myself was not the satisfaction of vindication in that hotel lobby, or the small profit from the house sale, or even the trust fund that would ensure my parents' financial security. It was the understanding that I had spent 34 years seeking validation from people who had not been capable of giving it, and that my worth existed independent of their recognition. I had built companies and solved complex security problems and earned millions and achieved everything I had set out to achieve. But the hardest thing I had ever done was look at my parents in that hotel and say, "I need you to do the work before we can have a real relationship," and then actually mean it enough to walk away until they did. The foundation I had built over these 6 months was not made of grand gestures or expensive gifts or achievements that could be listed on a Forbes profile. It was made of boundaries and honesty, and the daily choice to value myself, even when the people I most wanted approval from had failed to do so. I looked out at the Boston skyline visible through my office window, the spring afternoon light making the harbor sparkle in the distance, and I felt something settle in my chest that I had been chasing my entire life, a sense of being enough exactly as I was. I built my own foundation, I thought, and for the first time in my life it felt solid.